Hello A and P1 students. This is Gina Piscatelli with a lecture on the spinal cord. I'm sorry about Monday's real class time. That didn't work out very well. I will try again on Wednesday because I think it's going to go better. But nonetheless, let's continue with the spinal cord. We're going to look at the anatomy of the cord, its function as well, and how motor and sensory information is organized within the cord. And these regions of organization are called columns and tracts. So I'll introduce that to you as well. All of the information that you need to know from this lecture is listed in study questions 14, 15, and 16. Let's spend just a minute looking at this picture of the spinal cord because it tells us a lot about the anatomy. So this is from a cadaver, and the first thing that you can tell is that the vertebrae have been taken off because the lamina of the vertebrae were chiseled off so that the spine could come off. So that process is called a laminectomy. You see a little bit of the vertebra left right here. And you can also see that there are rootlets coming off. These are going to form or are part of a spinal nerve that will be exiting the vertebral canal. So the spinal cord is within the vertebral canal, and what you can make out here is probably arachnoid matter. Here's some blood vessels, and also the dura mater is deep to that, at least in this view. Of course, the dura mater is superficial overall, but if you're looking from this view, it would be deep. Okay, let's talk about the function a little bit first. The spinal cord has two main functions. One is just to provide a pathway for communication between the brain and the body. The other is to operate as a somatic or peripheral reflex center. So first, the communication pathway involves information going to or from the brain. Same to or from the body. So between the brain and the body. We call information that's traveling from the body to the brain, shown by this red arrow, ascending information. We call ascending information that goes from the body to the brain. And descending information, shown by this blue arrow, goes from the brain to the body. Now the reflex center involves sensory information coming in from the body to the spinal cord. And rather than going all the way up to the brain to elicit a response, instead what happens is sensory information comes into the spinal cord, and the spinal cord right away has a motor response of some sort. So we call it a reflex because it's so fast and it doesn't involve the brain. The gross anatomy of the spinal cord is apparent in this picture. It's a rope-like or cylinder of nervous tissue that travels within or lies within the vertebral canal that's cut and covered by all three meninges. So the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. All three. The spinal cord proper starts up at the foramen magnum, and it ends somewhere between L1 and L2 vertebrae. So this happens to be the L2 vertebrae. I know this because I counted and stuff. And so beyond that, you have no cord proper. Beyond that, you have nerves or nerve bundles called the cauda equina, still contained within the vertebral canal, But individual nerves will eventually emerge out of the vertebral canal, and you can see down here, to reach muscles and glands and things. You see the same here between the ribs. There are spinal nerves coming out of the vertebral canal as well. So there's different regions of the spinal cord with which we should be familiar, and they are named according to where the nerves come out. So I think it might be better to start with the names and types of spinal nerves. So spinal nerves are named based on the vertebrae or the vertebral foramen from which they emerge. So notice this first orange one right here. That's the first thoracic spinal nerve, and it is emerging between two thoracic vertebrae. So we have 8 pairs, because these spinal nerves are bilateral. We have 8 pairs of cervical nerves. We have 12 pairs of thoracic nerves and 5 pairs of lumbar nerves. There's also 5 sacral nerves and 1 coccygeal. Now, for the most part, the number of nerves matches the number of vertebrae, except for cervical. Cervical, there's an extra. Remember, you only have 7 cervical vertebrae. So what that means is there's an extra nerve that comes out on top of the first cervical vertebrae. So notice that a coccygeal nerve comes between 2 coccygeal vertebrae, and the sacral nerves come out of the vertebral canal between 2 bones of the sacrum. Lumbar nerves come out of the vertebral canal between 2 lumbar vertebrae, and a thoracic nerve comes out of the vertebral canal between 2 thoracic vertebrae. Now let's look instead at regions of the spinal cord. For the most part, it matches up. So the cervical segment or region of the cord, it really does line up with 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, not quite. Yeah, 7 vertebrae. But it's based on where those nerve cell bodies are located. So the 8 spinal nerves originate in the cervical spine. The 12 thoracic nerves originate in the thoracic region of the spinal cord, which generally corresponds with the 12 vertebrae. And the 5 lumbar nerves originate in the lumbar region of the spinal cord. Now this is where it's a little bit tricky, because here is where you have thoracic vertebrae. That's what you have there, thoracic vertebrae. But it's called the lumbar region of the spinal cord because the nerves move downwards and come out between the lumbar vertebrae. Everything else sort of matches out. The sacral and coccygeal part of the cord, again, are very high. The cord doesn't run down here. There's no cord beyond L2. So what has to happen is that the nerves have to travel in the cauda equina within the vertebral canal to get out. I hope that made sense. So there's certain parts of the spinal cord with which we should be familiar, and I have them listed here. There's basically 5 things that you want to be aware of. The cervical region is enlarged, as is the lumbar region. So right here and right here. And that is to accommodate the number of nerves that have to leave from this region to control both limbs. So the nerves that control arm movement will originate in the cervical cord, and the nerves that control leg movement will originate in the lumbar region. That's why it's enlarged. The point at the end of the spinal cord is called the conus medullaris. I'm not exactly sure why we learned that, but it's just a tapering. It's kind of like a V. And then beyond that is the cauda equina, and that's just a bundle of nerves that are traveling inferiorly within the vertebral canal. Now the spinal cord is actually somewhat anchored. It floats in the vertebral canal, but it's somewhat anchored by a few things. One is that superiorly, of course, it's attached to the brain, and the brain's not going to move very much because it's within the skull. The vertebral canal isn't very wide, so it can't move back and forth anyway on its own very much, the spinal cord. But in addition, these nerves kind of anchor the spinal cord in position. But one thing that's also helpful, so that it doesn't curl up, I guess, is that there is a ligament. It's a connective tissue, a fibrous connective tissue that connects the conus medullaris to the coccyx bone, and it's called the phylum terminale. And I have a picture on the next slide I'll show you. So this is again from a cadaver, and the cauda equina nerves have been separated out. And this is the conus, well, I guess really this is the conus medullaris, and the phylum terminale is in the center. It would go to the coccyx bone. And then the two structures on either side of the phylum terminale they've left in place, those are the coccygeal nerves. So the spinal cord is protected by various tissues. This is a rather complicated looking picture. So this is the body of the vertebrae. And on both sides of the spinal cord, all the way around it, you will see some adipose tissue. These tissues are called epidural tissues because they're superficial to the dura mater. So there's the yellow adipose, and there's also blood vessels there. Then surrounding the spinal cord, which I've mentioned before, are the three meninges. Superficially is the dura mater. You can see here it's kind of gray. Then there's the arachnoid matter, which looks, I don't know, goldish colored. And then the pia mater is basically transparent. It looks like the same color as the spinal cord. The cerebral spinal fluid that we learned about when we discussed the brain is located in the same space, and that is the subarachnoid space. So the subarachnoid space is in between, oops, that's not accurate. I have to erase that. The subarachnoid space is between the pia mater and the arachnoid matter right there. There's also cerebral spinal fluid in the center, in a canal, a hole inside the spinal cord, and that's nice for diffusion, to have something on the inside diffusing out while there's substances from the outside diffusing in. So no substance has to go all the way across the spinal cord. So this picture better shows you the location and the floating of the spinal cord in relation to the dura mater. So here are the lamina that were cut in that first picture I showed you, so they could take that off. Here's the epidural space that contains the epidural tissues, a lot of adipose there. And then the dura mater is the brown tissue, and the arachnoid matter is the blue tissue. And then notice there's a space before you get to the pink pia mater. And the subarachnoid space has thin fiber-like projections that reminded someone of a spider's legs, but it connects the pia mater. They connect the pia mater to the arachnoid matter. One thing clinically that you might be interested in, since we're just looking at the gross anatomy of the spinal cord, is how do they get a sample of cerebral spinal fluid? How do they know where to go, and why do they go where they do? What they do is they to collect a sample of cerebral spinal fluid, they want to use a procedure where they puncture the meninges. They have to go through the dura and the arachnoid meninges, and they want to do it lower than L2. It's usually done at like L4, and that is so they don't hit the spinal cord proper and cause damage. And some reasons for collecting cerebral spinal fluid is that there are sometimes compounds, chemical compounds in there that help us determine what kind of neurological disorder someone has. There's inflammatory compounds. Certain cancers give off certain chemicals, and infections, of course, you could check to see if there's white blood cells that have migrated in that location, or you can just look for bacteria. So there's a lot of different reasons to do it. Now we're going to look at more detail cross-sectional anatomy of the spinal cord. And we're just going to use this diagram because I think it's the easiest. The first thing I want you to notice is you can tell the difference between the anterior and the posterior cord based on a location of a fissure. So notice that here this anterior or ventral, I should write ventral because that's the same. Okay, it looks like I'm a kindergartner. It's hard to draw with a mouse or write with a mouse. Okay, so this anterior fissure is called the anterior median fissure, and it does not exist on the dorsal side or the posterior side. There is a division between the right and left cord posteriorly as well, but not a wide gap, so it's just called a sulcus. The other thing that I'd like you to notice, besides telling anterior from posterior, is to notice the locations of white matter versus gray matter. You may remember in the brain that gray matter was superficial and white matter was deep. The opposite is true in the spinal cord. So in the spinal cord, the white matter is superficial and the gray matter is deep. Okay, I'd also like to sort of introduce the spinal nerves to you just a little bit, anatomy, because everywhere we go in the cord, at least for this lecture, you're going to see this picture, and it would be nice to know what these things mean. So this is a spinal nerve out here, and over here is the beginning of a spinal nerve. And now information is traveling in two directions in this spinal nerve, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. On the posterior or dorsal side of the cord, this nerve begins as rootlets. We call these dorsal rootlets. And then laterally you'll see this dorsal root ganglion, and a ganglion is just a collection of cell bodies. So there'll be little round cell bodies located in there. And then these are the ventral rootlets. And the rootlets merge and they become what we call roots. So a spinal nerve is made up of both components of the dorsal root and the ventral root. And we will talk about what's in those roots a little bit later. So sticking with just gray matter versus white matter to begin with, this is a magnified view of the spinal cord that's been stained with like a purple substance. And the purple substance picks up certain proteins. And notice that you can clearly see some neurons' cell bodies in this gray matter. So this is why gray matter appears darker, because cell bodies have lots of organelles and they stain darker. White matter, on the other hand, looks white because you will not see cell bodies of neurons. Instead, you mainly will see axons out here that have been most likely, most of them are myelinated, and myelin appears white. So that's why white matter is white. Now out here there are many cells, and you can see little nuclei here and there, but those are just supportive cells. They're not the big neurons. So white matter appears white because the majority of the substance is myelin, axons. Okay, let's look at some specific regions of white matter and gray matter. There are 3 locations of white matter on each side of the spinal cord. There are posterior columns, lateral columns, and anterior columns. So the white matter is divided into columns, and the gray matter is divided into horns. So there's a dorsal horn, a lateral horn, and a ventral horn, not a root, Gina. Sorry. You have to fix that. Okay, I think it's all better now. So the gray matter is divided into horns, dorsal, lateral, and ventral. And the white matter is divided into columns, dorsal, lateral, and ventral once again. Or you can use posterior and anterior. Either way. Now the reason we talk about these different regions is because we're interested in understanding what the organization of sensory and motor is within the spinal cord. To do that, I think it's helpful to first look at the neurons in a spinal nerve, and then we'll look at the cord. So sensory information always comes into the spinal cord and the dorsal region. So here we have sensory information, and it is traveling in a spinal nerve to the spinal cord. So dorsal is always sensory. So let's look at a sensory neuron, because these are the weird neurons. Remember that a dendrite carries an electrical signal towards the cell body. So that's what this blue structure is here. That is a dendrite of a sensory neuron, as is the green one. They both are. And then the cell bodies of sensory neurons are located within the dorsal root ganglion. And these are the axons traveling into the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. Now let's look ventrally a little bit. So In the ventral part of a spinal nerve, we have information leaving the spinal cord, going out the spinal nerve, and to the body. Just a delay. I don't know why. There. Okay. So what we have in this gray matter are motor neurons, the cell bodies of motor neurons, and then the axons of motor neurons travel out the dorsal root and into the spinal nerve. Only thing we haven't talked about are interneurons, because if you notice, there is an sensory axon coming in to this dorsal horn, but then I see cell bodies. These are interneurons, and these interneurons are really short, and they're just connecting information from the sensory neuron to the cell body of the motor neuron. So in the horns, we also have organization, not just, within the dorsal roots of the nerves. In the horns, you here have cell bodies of interneurons. And then in the lateral horn and the ventral horn, you have cell bodies of motor neurons, except two different kinds of motor neurons. It turns out that the lateral horn contains motor neurons that are going to go to glands and smooth muscle, whereas the ventral horn contains cell bodies of motor neurons going out to skeletal muscle that you can consciously control. The white matter columns also are organized by types of information, but first we just call them ascending or descending because they're axons. So axons are just traveling, they're sending a signal either from the body to the brain or from the brain to the body. So the tracts are organized based on the white matter columns have different tracts, and the tracts are based on what direction the information's going. Is it going up or down? Where is it going? What's the final destination? Like which muscle in which arm? And the type of information. So motor is pretty much motor, but sensory, there's a lot of different kinds of sensory. And so ascending axons are grouped according to things like pain, temperature, tickling, that kind of stuff. So we're going to look at ascending and descending tracts within the three different types of columns. So the posterior column is easy because all of the information is ascending. So essentially you can think of that as sensory information going up to the brain. The lateral column has both ascending tracts and descending tracts. Not that I'm going to make you memorize where they're going, where these axons are going, but the ascending tracts are destined for the cerebellum. The descending tracts, the ones that are going down from the brain, they originated from the cerebrum. Then the anterior column has both ascending tracts and descending tracts. So the sensory tracts, or the tracts that are ascending, are going to the cerebrum. So you can think of that as primary sensory. That's supposed to be primary and that's supposed to be an S. Clearly, I can't write with the mouse. So to the cerebrum. The descending tracts are probably coming from the cerebellum, but they're also coming from the primary motor cortex as well. and we're going to look at a couple of examples of those. So there's both ascending and descending in most columns, but the posterior column only ascending tracts. There are different names of ascending and descending tracts. You're lucky that you don't have to remember them, but I wanted to point them out to you so you have a better idea of what I'm talking about. So in the posterior column, notice that all of the right and left posterior column completely blue. That stands for ascending. And there's 2 tracts subdivided in each. So if I divide this correctly, you end up with 2 tracts in each. This one is called the cuneate fasciculus, and this tract is called the gracile fasciculus. You don't really have to know the difference, okay? It's just to show you an example, but these would carry different kinds of information, like temperature. That's supposed to be an M, or pain. Descending tracts are shown in red, and the ones that I think are relevant to you are the ones that are going to the skeletal muscles from the primary motor cortex. We call these tracts, and they're outlined here, funny, 2 different spots, they're called corticospinal tracts because they're originating in the cortex. They go through the spinal cord. Eventually they're going to go through the pyramids of the medulla as well. I mean, like in between the brain and the cord. So as I mentioned, the different tracts of sensory or white matter columns, for the cuneate fasciculus, this is where you'd have touch, and then this region is called the spinothalamic tract, and it carries pain and temperature. Note, you do not need to know the particular names of these fasciculi and tracts, okay? You need to know posterior column, lateral column, and anterior column. Which ones have ascending and which ones have descending. That's all. But I thought you might want to see how it's organized. Stupid. So study question 16 is, it basically asks you to trace the pathway of somatic sensory information from a nerve to the brain, and it asks you how many neurons would that information travel through. So we're going to do that. The sensory neurons, the picture on your left over here, but this is the right of the brain. This is the left of the brain. Drives me crazy. Okay, if we start on the right side of the body and pain comes in through a dendrite, then to the dorsal root ganglion where the sensory cell body is, then the axon of the sensory neuron to the spinal cord. That's our first neuron. Then it synapses with another neuron that crosses in the spinal cord before it begins ascending. So this is the axon. The dendrites aren't even shown around the cell body. The axon travels superiorly, or ascends, all the way through the level of the medulla oblongata, past the cerebral peduncles, which is what these are right here, and to the thalamus. So that's our second neuron. So that's number 2. It's a long one. And then the third sensory neuron starts in the thalamus and travels to the primary motor cortex. So there's 3 different neurons involved from the body to the brain in sensory pathways. Now we'll trace the pathway of somatic motor information. So motor information is descending information, leaving the primary motor cortex and going out to the body. So this is where we're going to go out to the body, somewhere out here. So the first neuron, I'm going to start on the right because of the way the diagram is drawn. And this is left. Does not like that. So we're going to start on the right side. And we're going to start with this first neuron. Here is the cell body in the precentral gyrus of the primary motor cortex. This is its axon traveling inferiorly, going past and through the cerebral peduncles, through the medulla pyramids, where crossing happens. So this axon crosses over in the spinal cord, and now it's on the left side. So the motor information started on the right side, but it's going to end up on the left side. And so it continues down the spinal cord in the white matter. That's what's important because it's an axon. It's traveling in white matter. I'll erase this so it's not so sloppy. And then eventually it synapses on another neuron in the gray matter. It doesn't really matter which horn it's in for us. We don't really care. It's in one of the horns. And then there's another neuron that travels out the spinal nerve. So there's only 2 motor neurons in a pathway of motor information. That's the bottom line. The other thing that's kind of interesting clinically is that sometimes when someone has a movement disorder, they will talk about whether or not it's an upper motor neuron disease or a lower motor neuron disease. So when there's been a spinal cord injury, that's considered a lower motor neuron. If there's been a brain injury of some type, that's an upper motor neuron problem. Okay, the next few slides only have review questions for you with answers. So you don't have to really listen anymore. You can just look at the PowerPoint, and I have answers posted as well. Okay? Thank you very much.